The two powerful narratives, Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 novella The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Australian TV show Cleverman Episode 1, aired in 2016, are shaped by specific socio-cultural contexts, revealing universal connections and experiences, as both stories deconstruct fears of the other in relation to their respective society, Victorian London and contemporary Australia. Jekyll and Hyde deconstructs the binary of lower and upper class, set by Victorian-era rigid social structures. Cleverman draws on the awareness of dehumanisation and oppression of Indigenous cultures to challenge the normalisation of oppressive control set by those in positions of power, illuminating the continuing binary within Australia of the treatment of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous Australians. Within Jekyll and Hyde, the binary between the lower and upper class, representing a sort of bifurcation of society, is initially reinforced through the Victorian stereotypes of how criminality could be identified by characteristics such as deformity. This value was reinforced as lower-class Victorian health issues made deformity prevalent, feeding upper-class visceral fears. Manipulation of the Gothic form created a bifurcated protagonist, Jekyll and Hyde, who represents society's own divisions. Mr. Hyde, described as Enfield as a damned juggernaut who must be deformed somewhere, he gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point, represents Victorian fears born from the rise of scientific theories such as Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and Lombroso's theory of criminal atavism. Hyde is portrayed to the Victorian audience as a familiar immoral character, validating this assumed evil nature through his assault on symbols of helplessness, a small girl and an elderly man. Dr. Jekyll's physical and moral characteristics juxtaposed with Mr. Hyde's, being introduced as a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, aligning with the image of an ideal Victorian man, therefore not possessing immoral characteristics. Stevenson foregrounds paradox in revealing the bifurcation of Dr. Jekyll transforming into Mr. Hyde. Like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. The novella fuses both society and the individual with the concept of an other that must be feared, embodied within the one central protagonist, reinforcing the idea that powerful narratives manipulate aspects of their textual form to engage and challenge audiences. Through a post-colonial lens, Cleverman represents the oppressive control of Indigenous Australians within a Eurocentric Australia. This persecution of otherness is symbolised by the restrictions placed on the hairy people, a humanoid species distinct from humans, imbued with features such as great physical strength and longer lifespans that create fear within the Eurocentric Australia. The chiaroscuro lighting framing mise-en-scène becomes an extended metaphor for the power dynamics of the dominant yet fearful white society. Minister Matthews' interview scene, addressing a primarily white audience, is brightly lit from a low-angle shot that clearly connotes his agency, with the backdrop of the city's skyscraper symbols of power behind him further reinforcing the dominance of the views of what he represents. Matthews refers to the Hairies as subhuman and feeds societal fear with his political speech. This government's commitment to keeping these dangerous subhumans within the area known as the zone. Unchecked escalation of social oppression fueling unjustified paranoia within white society sets the scene for the state-sanctioned detention of the Hairies into a ghetto, as their otherness justifies the restriction of basic freedoms. This alludes to prevalent post-colonial Indigenous mistreatment by the government, such as disproportionate incarceration rates of Indigenous youth. The episode's raid scene also shadows this notion of white virtue as the raid takes place at night, connecting darkness with the exposure of reality. Cleverman navigates light and darkness as a medium to critique the notion of the other and to demonstrate the bifurcation of this society fed by different contextual values. Similar to how Stevenson subverts Victorian expectations of the notion that outward appearances reflect inward morality, Cleverman subverts contemporary audience expectations that symbolic light and wealth characterize virtuous society. Instead, light and dark reinforce binaries of power and powerlessness and operate as metaphors for public facade versus the dark reality of the society within Cleverman. Linking both texts, both narratives offer powerful narratives through their characterization, and Cohen represents a different form of the bifurcated protagonist, having inherited the spirit that Uncle Jimmy breathed, and possessing both spiritually indigenous and human qualities. Cleverman suggests a bifurcated protagonist that offers hope for bridging the social divisions within this world. The divisive otherness both societies fear exists within the individual, provoking audiences to consider this confronting possibility that what they fear is within themselves. Dr. Jekyll feeds these fears, while Cohen offers hope of overcoming them. Both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Cleverman Episode 1 generate ongoing cultural consideration regarding political and social influences on society's approach to values and concerns, and both provide, to a great extent, reflections on their respective societies, revealing universal connections through intertextual discussion.